On the feast of St. Pius V, the words in the first reading are very apt. What is expected of the steward is that he be a faithful administrator of the Lord's goods. And so it is that this saint, who, being a Dominican, gave to the Church the habit of seeing the Holy Father in white, because he wore the white of his order, and that also to some extent gave the form of the papal garment. This is an example of someone who precisely wielded well his responsibility. He was elected at a time when the man was needed who would apply with firmness and authenticity what in non-Catholic circles is referred to as the Counter-Reformation, but which would correctly be referred to simply as the Catholic Reformation, when things were cleaned up and order was brought out of a certain measure of chaos. By now we are used to having the system of seminaries for the formation of priests, until the application, and that took a while, of the decrees of the Council of Trent. It was somewhat more elastic. It took a while for the application to have an effect. The dogmatic council, which gave us essentially our clear doctrine, of which the Second Vatican Council was, in a sense, an unpacking for our time, with always at the bottom of the page references to the Council of Trent as the point of authority. The Council of Trent was one that acted with that power of anathematizing, and when one has a formula, if someone will not, or if someone will, let him be anathema. Anathema sit. Well, if that is there, that then gives you parameters of defined dogma. It doesn't say all that can be said on the subject, but what is there within those parameters is protected by the Holy Spirit, who is guiding the Church to all truth. And so it is a dogmatic council. Second Vatican Council essentially is a pastoral council, but it does have dogmatic issues coming in. The First Vatican Council, of course, is dogmatic and places in relief the figure of the Supreme Pontiff, but it was interrupted by the Franco-Prussian War and left the Pontiff there very high up, and then the notion of collegiality was worked out calmly by the Council Fathers at the Second Vatican Council. And by the way, it was thought that this was going to be a far more difficult issue than that of liturgy at the outbreak of the Second Vatican Council, because it was difficult to obtain a complete accord on the nature of collegiality. But by now we are used to the whole notion of synods and episcopal conferences, while all these are fairly recent in time in their present form. We are only in the immediate of the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, as was the first generation after the First Council of Trent. Now, what happened at the first diffusion of the new missal was that it gave a great unification throughout the Church, and made it also easier for the priest to go from A to B with all in one standard volume, which he would find everywhere on earth. It was important for the missions, for instance, and it gave a truly Catholic nature to our faith and practice for those centuries which elapsed from 1570 until 1970. One was at home in any Catholic church, and one could answer and understand the prayers. Now, in theory, the same is true right now, because one does know what is being said through knowing in one's own language what is being said, and therefore the equivalent. But there are certain problems insofar as one can be a bit surprised at what one finds unexpectedly in some areas where culture invades even the sacred and can be very upsetting at times, and it is too raucous and too loud. We need to be careful in the manipulation of the sacred, making of it a human event only. Pope Benedict was aware of the way in which the serene application of the Spirit-led purification of church life, that is, the finding again of the noble lines of architecture in the liturgy without the excessive amount of, as it were, liturgical statuary in between, where it was difficult to see exactly what should be seen first of all in the thrust of liturgical celebration, because there were lots of things going on. This, unfortunately, was not applied as it should have been. To understand what was being done by the Council Fathers, one has to see what the Council Fathers did at the Council of Trent. Essentially, they had before them the liturgical families around. They had there in the documents of liturgy that they were trying to standardize essentially many strands of venerable liturgical tradition. They behaved with great respect before these venerable strands, and therefore instinctively what did they do? They maintained the ancient that they found. The beeline was actually that this happened too. They actually kept, therefore, several liturgical strands, which independently would have been sufficient, but put together made of the Tridentine Mass as we know it something very heavy. It explains why, in practice, when one is celebrating in the old rite, one is finding that one is starting the celebration more than once. Difficult to explain this to someone who doesn't know what celebrating the old rite means in practice, but it is there if one is unpeeling what is there. There are several beginnings maintained. One is making the sign of the cross, which is initially a beginning, more than once to begin. Therefore one is beginning to begin and beginning again to begin. And the same thing happens in several moments of the liturgy in the old rite. Because of the venerability of ancient prayers and ancient rites, they kept them, but that led to a very large number of parallel prayers, which came from different liturgical families, but said essentially in their own way the same sort of thing. And also to many signs of the cross. They were each one often coming from a liturgical family, but they were all kept. So it made a very large number of gestures, genuflections likewise. And then, at the culminating point of the consecration, one had there what actually was an evolution, but then led to something quite heavy, insofar as the reaction against a heresy which was endemic at a time before the Council of Trent led to a maintaining of a second genuflection, because what had actually happened was that originally the priest would have genuflected after the consecration, but then to indicate to the people with insistence that the real presence was there, the elevation was added, and that's not as primitive as people actually think. It was added, and therefore a second genuflection was added after it. So we have there two, and the same thing happened with the chalice. We have the genuflection after the consecration, the elevation, and then a second genuflection. So this was logically what the Second Vatican Council had to address. It was something to be simplified so as to show the main thrust of what's happening and to reduce the complication. In itself, it's a good instinct, as one would do, as I'm saying, with a large church, a monastic church, For instance, comparing what happened between Cluny and Cîteaux. Cîteaux wanted the clear lines of architecture with not too many statues walking around, and so they would see how a church would point heavenwards with beautiful Gothic lines. If the statue is walking all over the place, it's not quite so simple. One's eye is distracted. And so it is, if one compares certain styles of architecture in different countries, one sees that the Baroque style is very heavy, whereas, for instance, an English classic church can be very simple but actually beautiful in its Gothic style. The eye is carried upward. And by the way, it's carried where it should land, and the architect meant it to land in a certain place, the high altar. And the natural centre of attention would be the tabernacle, not the throne of a man. And if one puts the altar where it was not meant to be, it doesn't quite work architecturally. And so, when it comes to seeing what actually the Spirit was trying to say to the churches, we need to see the problem and to see how it was in some way attacked. Unfortunately, people are not aware of the profound issues. All that is in the present comes from the old and must be seen as such, and an intelligent application of the old leads to a very reverent celebration of the new, because the awareness of the continuity is there, and it can be done, and often is done in a good monastery. There's no mental break, it's the same carrying through. Why? Because the interiority protects it. It's a manifestation of something there in the heart and in relationship. If that's not there, then of course the application will be very human. But that is the main area of difficulty. The human has invaded the divine, and it's no longer in that mode of upward thrust, but very much of horizontal orientation. Man is talking to man, talking about man and talking in a human mode. So here is the area of real problem. It's not quite so simple as to blame the Vatican Council for what is actually the fault of man afterwards. And Benedict XVI knew the profound problem of the equation. And so it is that he wanted the availability again of the unmangled Tridentine. The fortunate part of it is that the Tridentine rite was not messed up. It had started to be changed by 1965, and people thought that actually would be then the beginning of a settlement, because already under John the 23rd changes had been brought in, and by 1965 we had the intermediary version, which was essentially Tridentine but actually with quite a few simplifications. It wasn't actually going to be the end of it, and of course we had something quite different by 1969. But it's not essentially that different if one sees how, in the mind of the Council Fathers, the new comes from the old at each point. And it's only when one knows both rites that one sees that happening. And those who have not known both rites don't see it happening or see where they're coming from. And therefore, they only have the new and the new interpretation of the new, which is miles away from actually the calm, serene application of new from old at each stage. And so it is that we had what led to a recuperating of the undamaged Tridentine rite, which stayed put essentially 1962, and that was emphasised. If one was taking that again, it had to be 1962 one, which is slightly simplified with regard to certain minor things, with regard to the Council of Trent itself, but essentially it is a Tridentine preserved and remained pure. And so that's what should happen, and because it's there undamaged, it is a safe refuge. One knows that going to the old rite in the 1962 Missal, one will find obedience to the centuries and to the Holy Spirit. Man does not enter into it. All he's got to do is obey. But he's got to obey, and he can't mix the two rites. And Benedict XVI knew it full well, that people, quite rightly, were upset and wanting that safe refuge. They were being so badly upset by what they found in the bad application of what could have been a very positive balm, that they didn't know where to go. And he also insisted on the continuity and the parallel nature of the two forms of the same. It is the Roman Mass always coming through. And therefore he wanted that clarity expressed in the expression ordinary form and extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. It is the Roman family. Very different from that of the East, because the Roman Rite has that particularity of being very sober. Its sobriety comes through in both new and old, compared with the very florid nature of the Eastern Rite, always sung, always with incense, and always 3 hours long. Where am I landing? The presence is there in the new and the old, but one can say with a certain certainty that many graces are being lost in the bad application of the new. Why? Because the honour and glory given to God is very often, in the parts that pertain to man, lacking. The space in which the Spirit can act is reduced. Why? It's wordy. Noisy celebrants outside in their conversation are noisy inside in their celebration, and all one has quite often in the average celebration is an unstoppable flow of words, made worse by incompetence on the part of readers, for instance, and also the casual coming up of people from the congregation in bad garments, blue jeans, open-neck t-shirts for men, and worse still for the women, does not add to the honour and glory given to the Creator. And these were not necessarily in the minds of the Council Fathers, protected by the Holy Spirit. The result of insistence of participation badly understood. Everyone must be doing something all the time, otherwise he's not participating. A complete misconception. And also in this realm, Benedict XVI tried to insist that participation is very different from what people think it is, and it can be made of pure interiority. And with tongue-in-cheek, at one point he said, why should someone, in the interest of participation, have to sing, and he can't sing a note, and impede my participation when I could easily participate when somebody well-trained, a choir, a scholar, was singing perfectly well what they'd always sung through the centuries. One is mystic, the other is purely human, and upsets the mystic part of our celebration. I conclude. As Benedict XVI pointed out, what has been held sacred by our predecessors for generations and generations, by the previous centuries in fact, cannot suddenly be held unsacred. And the Church cannot turn against itself and deny itself. We are in continuity with the centuries. And when we think of what the martyrs underwent, this was to celebrate sometimes in hiding, even in the Tower of London, the sacred mysteries before being martyred. When we think of the famine times in Ireland, penal times when people lost everything but were faithful to the Mass, their participation was far greater than those who strum loudly with guitars and think they have the maximum. And also, that is worse, in the old rite and in the new rite well understood, God is the centre of attention. There is an itch right now, in human terms, to use the podium of the liturgy to draw applause to man. It's an opportunity where one can gain authority and indeed power. One can have a sway by the choice one insists on having in different parts of the Mass. Man is actually manipulating what is divine. This was miles away from the centuries and even from the Council Fathers. The mystique and therefore the inner life of the Catholic Church is, let's say it, far better expressed by the upward thrust of a good Tridentine Mass than by a DJ making a lot of noise in the modern Mass. It's not the modern Mass is not valid or indeed wanted, but it is something which is badly applied, and therefore we understand correctly why the Holy Spirit would have us take seriously the invitation to be aware of our roots and to respect greatly those who suffer rightly, who are not always old people, but can be very young and very aware, far more than those who precisely belong to the smashing generation, because the generation that came out of the Second Vatican Council was a generation of dismantlers, and the generation of dismantlers, unfortunately, is still quite often in authority, because they became the bishops and leaders of the generation that followed, and they are still able to exclude those who precisely are aware, perhaps more than they are, of the past, from having key points themselves. One last point. A good way of doing that for them is to talk in a language which in some way implies that they are superior. E.g., someone can't celebrate in the Old Rite because he hasn't got Latin, and therefore, to avoid the inferiority complex of not having Latin, not having to admit it, he will perhaps say something to the effect that I don't want to go back in time or get in reverse gear, in such a way that he gives the impression that anyone who has that itch is inferior to himself, that going ahead is the way forward, and therefore to look back is to be in some way incomplete, without it rather than with it. The same thing can happen with regard to, for instance, a culture, a minority culture, a language issue. Because a person doesn't speak the language of the area, might be a minority language, that person then will start indirectly to show that he is superior, and that people therefore who have that language are in another degree, another category, category B. It's a way of not showing respect, again, for centuries that behind that culture might be rich, and to which that person has no access and can have no influence. We have to be careful, because actually those who make less noise sometimes have a greater awareness than the noisy ones who rule this planet, even liturgically.